right, good evening, friends. Welcome to the salon this evening with Dr. Roosevelt Montás. My name is Chris Stratton. I am the academic dean at Pacifica Christian High School, and it is my honor to be here. Unfortunately, Howard and Roberta could not be here tonight, and they're traveling. And luckily, I have Roberta's pomegranate-colored, purplish notepad here to do my introduction. The liberal arts is a subject that's near and dear to many of us in this room, and is something that I have dedicated myself to for the last 9 years. And I am very, very excited to be here tonight, hearing from Dr. Montás about his book and the virtues that go along with a liberal education. If you haven't picked up a copy of this, he's not paying me to say this. This is a great book, and may his number increase. I'm very, very excited to hear what he has to say to us tonight. Okay. Roosevelt Montás is a senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University and the former director of Columbia's Center for the Core Curriculum. He was born in the Dominican Republic and moved to New York as a teenager, where he attended public schools in Queens before entering Columbia College in 1991 through its Opportunities program. In 2003, he completed a PhD in English, also at Columbia. His dissertation, Rethinking America, won Columbia University's 2004 Bancroft Award. In 2000, he received the Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching by a graduate student. And in 2008, he received the Dominican Republic's National Youth Prize. He regularly teaches moral and political philosophy in the Columbia Core Curriculum, as well as seminars in American Studies. He is also director of the Center for American Studies, Freedom and Citizenship Program, which brings low-income high school students to the Columbia campus to study political theory and then helps them prepare successful applications to college. Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation, details the experiences of Montás as a student and teacher, telling the story of how the great books transformed his life and why they have the power to speak to people of all backgrounds. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Roosevelt Montás?
Thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege to be here before you tonight, and always, for me, makes me sort of rub my eyes and this belief that all of you will come here to hear me talk about liberal education, both that you came to hear about liberal education and that you came to hear me talk about liberal education seem hard to believe. And I'm very grateful to Fieldstead and to the Amundsons for sort of facilitating this event. It's been a long time in the making, and I've been looking forward to it since the possibility of it first came up. So I'm very, very happy to be here. Because it's become fashionable to say that you suffer from imposter syndrome, I'm not going to say that. But I do want to take note how honored I am to be here at this forum and to receive the gift of your attention. Social media companies have figured out and exploited the fact that the most valuable resource we have is our attention. And I feel honored to receive yours today, and I accept it with humility. I hope that what I have to say today proves to be meaningful to you. As I said, what I want to talk about is liberal education, whether teachers or writers, artists, readers, or simply citizens in a democracy. All of us here are concerned with liberal education. And liberal education has become, especially of late, a touchy subject. A few years ago, correctly anticipating the polarized political environment that seems to have disabled our culture from seeing straight, an executive at Gallup argued that the term liberal arts education is a marketing disaster and that higher education should drop it. One can't help but see his point. Liberal arts education manages to combine the political baggage of the word liberal with the widely reputed uselessness of studying art. I bet there's some art majors laughing over there. But since I'm not here to deliver a slogan or to make a TikTok post, but to give a talk, I am going to stick with the term liberal education. The gift of your attention allows us to pursue a trend of thought down to its conclusions, to trace an idea from the things it takes for granted to its necessary conclusions. Although my intellectual life involves a fair amount of writing and public speaking, my main occupation is as a teacher of undergraduate students, and that's the context from which I will treat the topic today. First, I want to say that liberal education is something that we owe our students by virtue of their humanity. It's a form of education that is due to them in consequence of the fact that they are free agents, individuals with the capacity and the inescapable responsibility of shaping the characters of their own lives. Liberal education sees them not as professionals in the making, but as whole human beings, and tries to equip them with the tools with which to face that condition in all of its mystery and its complexity. The concern of liberal education is not how to make a living, but how to live a life. I'll come back to this, but a lot of what motivates my work is that this vision of liberal education has been gradually eroded in colleges and universities, replaced by a discipline-based approach that treats students as early career scholars preparing for specialized studies in liberal arts disciplines. Liberal education is as old as a subject gets. Ever since people have been conscious of themselves as free agents, they have wondered about liberal education. You might think that you don't care about liberal education specifically or in particular, that it is an esoteric academic subject, but if you care about human freedom and about what it means to educate a person who is free, then you care about liberal education. And I want to say right here at the outset that though liberal education is of perennial importance, it is also an urgent issue in our society right now. Our political culture is faltering, and it is fracturing precisely along the lines that a liberal education is meant to address. I spend a lot of time in universities all over the country and see up close how higher education has been walking away from liberal education, diluting it, shunting it to the side. And this is not a trivial problem. The moral deformation we see in our politics is of a piece with the university's neglect of its mission to educate free citizens. And let me be clear that I'm not here referring to the decline in numbers in humanities and liberal arts majors. A liberal education has nothing to do with a liberal arts major. This is a conflation you hear everywhere. But the fact is that a liberal education is no less important for the chemist, for the computer scientist, for the banker, than it is for the historian and the critic and the humanities professor. They all need it the same. They all should get it the same. And let me try to specify more concretely what I mean by liberal education. The idea goes back to the ancient slave democracy of Athens. Until recently, democracies were always slave democracies. The great innovation of America was to attempt a democracy without slavery, an attempt that began in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, not in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, although the idea of political equality was everywhere in the rhetoric of the revolution. But in the slave democracy of Athens, where it was invented, liberal education was conceived as that education that was appropriate for a free citizen. Aristotle spoke of it as a kind of education given not because it is useful or necessary, but because it is noble and suitable for a free person. Now, remember that Athens was a direct democracy. Every citizen took part in the city's governance by voting on laws, serving in the army, sitting on juries, etc. The point of a liberal education was to equip citizens for the task of self-governance. To this day, democracies depend on a citizenry capable of discharging the duties for which a liberal education prepared Athenian citizens. Indeed, the possibility of democracy hinges on the success or failure of liberal education and of its being not an education for the elite, but an education for the demos, an education for the people at large. This understanding of liberal education as an education for freedom has immediate implications for what the content of such an education should be. One implication is that a liberal education should concern itself with reflection on what it means to live a full human life, on the nature of human excellence and the human good, what the Greeks called virtue. An obvious way to pursue this form of education is through courses in which students discuss works that over a long period of time have proved potent catalysts for reflection on the fundamental questions of human life. In other words, works that grapple with the core questions of politics, religion, and philosophy in ways that have shaped our world deserve a prominent place in liberal education. The aim of such an education is not to provide answers to those fundamental questions, but to bring them to life for the student and instill in them habits of reflection and inquiry that can serve as guides to life. This view makes me a traditionalist when it comes to questions of the curriculum, and I embrace that. Old books, even when written by retrograde white men, should feature prominently in the liberal education of young people. I won't dwell on this long, but let me offer this reflection from that radical antiquarian Friedrich Nietzsche to make my point. Here's a quote from Nietzsche. This is from Human, All Too Human. There are great advantages if at some point we estrange ourselves to a great extent from our age and are, as it were, driven away from its shores back into the ocean of archaic worldviews. Gazing from there toward the coast, we survey its entire shape for the first time and have the advantage of understanding it better as a whole than those who have never left it. So I love that idea of swimming out, rowing out to an ocean of archaic worldviews and then looking at our world. And from that vantage point, being able to see things that are impossible to see when you just stand where you are. It's a mistake to think that only works that deal with the contemporary heat and pressures and urgent issues illuminate our students. In fact, the present is so shrouded in editorial commentary and subjectivity that it is in fact often less visible, less transparent to the students than the past. So at the heart of liberal education, there should be small classes where students encounter common readings in major texts and learn to grapple with fundamental questions with nuance and civility. But the fact is that most college curricula do not offer such an education, despite what they say in their catalogs. They offer what my friend Chris Schneider, writing in Inside Higher Ed, recently called a LENO, liberal education in name only. When I applied to college, I had no idea what a liberal education was. I had the fortune of ending up at the one major research university that has a required great books liberal arts curriculum for all students, regardless of what major they pursue. It takes up most of the first 2 years of study at Columbia College. The way that intellectual experience expanded and transformed my inner life drives much of what I do to this day. In late 2021, I published a book that Christopher referred to kindly. Is it Christopher or Christian? It's Christopher. Okay, thank you. Christopher spoke kindly of, it's called Rescuing Socrates, how the great books changed my life, and why they matter for a new generation. As the title suggests, the book reflects on the role that liberal education has played in my life, but its deeper concern, it's about the imperative today for colleges and universities to take seriously their mission of educating students liberally, especially those students who come from what we call marginalized communities, people who have not had the resources, opportunities, and privileges that most people who have gone to college have had. By the time I started writing the book, I had spent 10 years as director of Columbia University's Center for the Core Curriculum. Even though I always recognized the value of liberal education to be rooted in a subjective and personal experience, throughout my time as director of Columbia's Core, I avoided making the case for liberal education with reference to my own life story. Like many immigrants, I harbor a profound distaste for the stereotypes associated with the immigrant story. You know, the cardboard cutout featuring the rise from poverty and marginality through hard work and education. It's not that these things aren't true about me, but that I have refused to turn those aspects of my life into an identity. I did not want my case for liberal education to be about my story. Yet, the experience of liberal education is inescapably personal, subjective, specific. So I knew that I could only write a book about liberal education in the first person and with my whole self in it. So the case I make for liberal education in the book synthesizes arguments and insights that had developed over the course of my academic career with reflection on my inner and outer life and how it has been shaped by my experience of liberal education. This is what Rescuing Socrates is about. With your indulgence, let me get some of the autobiographical details out of the way. I grew up in a small rural town in the Dominican Republic. I came to the United States not speaking English 2 days before my 12th birthday. When I was a child, my little mountain town was still immersed in the agrarian and pre-industrial rhythms of the 19th century. It extended 6 streets in one direction and 4 streets in another. My childhood address was Calle 6, Casa 7, the 7th house on the 6th street. I remember when roads were paved. I remember when we got running water. I grew up without a television, a stove, a refrigerator, or a phone. Sometimes I joke that I was raised in the 19th century among people who had come of age in the 18th century. So there is considerable distance, not measurable in miles, between the world in which I lived until I was 12 and this podium. I landed in New York City in May of 1985 with my older brother to join our mother who had immigrated 2 years earlier. In many ways, we were a typical Dominican immigrant family, poor, not speaking English, and with little knowledge of what my life in the U.S. would entail. My mother, who never finished high school, my father only attended up to the 4th grade. I am not just a first-generation college attendee, but I'm a first-generation high school graduate. My mother got a minimum wage in a job, minimum wage job in a garment factory in Brooklyn. My brother and I entered the New York City public schools, overcrowded as they were, and continue to be, but where free lunches supplied a good portion of our sustenance. When my mother lost her job, my brother and I moved to a basement room in a relative's house while mom fared for herself. We didn't live paycheck to paycheck since we didn't have jobs. We lived hand to mouth. I tell more of that story in the book. My point here is that when I speak about how a liberal education can illuminate a life, give people unique tools with which to navigate their inner and outer worlds and empower them to transform their reality, I speak from personal experience. Education, And liberal education in particular has the power and the tendency to transform one's life. But the way in which liberal education transforms people's lives is quite distinctive. For one thing, it plays out in as many forms as there are individuals in the world. Liberal education cannot have a predetermined outcome. This is why it can't be used for ideological indoctrination. It can't be used to turn people into liberals or to turn people into conservatives. Everyone who does it knows that liberal education is a profoundly inadequate vehicle for passing on pre-established truths, for ferrying students from where they are to a preconceived ideological position. The kind of transformation liberal education promotes, it's something that is spawned from within yourself, not something that is given to you from the outside. Another way in which the kind of transformation achieved through liberal education is distinctive is that it is thoroughgoing. It's like walking through a thick fog. It soaks you through and through. Liberal education doesn't just add more knowledge on top of your previous stock. Liberal education rearranges everything else that you know. You don't just end up with more knowledge, you end up with a different configuration of knowledge. Liberal knowledge, in other words, alters the internal proportions of your soul. Ralph Waldo Emerson said once that once the mind has encountered and absorbed an idea, it could never return to its original proportions. In liberal learning, there is no separation between what you know and who you are. That's why it is transformative. Let me invoke this experience of inner transformation by reading a quote, one of my favorite quotes in American literature. And it comes from one of my intellectual and political heroes, Frederick Douglass. This passage is from his 1845 autobiography narrative of the life of an American slave. And let me tell you, just set the scene here. Douglass, who's born Frederick Bailey, Frederick Douglass is a name that he adopts shortly after his freedom. He adopts the last name Douglass. Born in a plantation in the eastern shore of Maryland, rural, sort of backwoods Maryland. He lives there until he's 8. And when he is 8 years old, his legal owner, sends him to live with his brother, that is the owner's brother, in Baltimore, sort of the big commercial port city. It's the first time that Douglass leaves the plantation. He's, as you might imagine, just blown away and wowed by everything he sees. He goes there because Thomas Auld, who's going to be his new master there, has a little boy, and Frederick is supposed to be a sort of household slave and companion to the little boy. So this quote happens shortly after his arrival in Baltimore. This passage uses the N-word, which I am going to replace with the word slave, because that word has become, even though it was a slur when Douglass wrote it here, has become so indecent and offensive that many people just find it inappropriate to be said in a public setting. So I'm going to, in deference to that, just replace it with the word slave. But your well-trained American ear will know exactly where that word appears in the mouth of the master here. Okay, so here goes Douglass. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point in my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a slave an inch, he will take an ell. A slave should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that slave, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. And Douglas returns to his own words. These words sank deep into my heart and called into existence a new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing mystery, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. Now, notice this. Douglas grows up in the plantation surrounded by other black slaves, knows them intimately. He knows that they're not weaker, dumber, in any way inferior to the white people who he also knows well from the household, from the big house. They're not smarter, they're not stronger, they're not in any way better than the black people. But everywhere he sees white people enslaving black people, and he can't figure out how this is, why this is, how did this come about? And here, in hearing his master talk about the power of literacy and the power of learning, he grabs the key. From that moment, he says, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which, by the merest accident, I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn to read. And boy, did he learn to read and write, and made a life as a writer, a newspaper editor, an orator, and one of the most important thinkers in American political thought, one of the thinkers that has most poignantly and powerfully brought into resolution and brought into application the principles upon which this nation, which enslaved him, was founded. But today you might say there's no more slavery. You know, slavery is a thing of the past, outlawed by the 13th Amendment. It's true. There's no longer here in the U.S. chattel slavery where you and your children are literally owned by someone else 24/7 and forever. But there are other forms of subjugation, coercion, domination that pervade modern life and that have much in common with slavery. Liberal education, the kind of education into which Douglas saw a window in his acquisition of literacy today, is also aimed at charting a path from existing forms of slavery to freedom, at somehow transforming the student in such a way that he or she is forever unfit to be dominated. Let me point to two broad areas in which forms of subjugation persist in contemporary life, one public and one private. One pervasive form of domination that exists around us is what traditionally has been called wage slavery. That's when you sell your labor for a period of time and are, during that time, effectively subject to a master. In antiquity, this form of servitude was considered beneath the dignity of any self-respecting person. But it's almost taken for granted today that this is okay, that it's some kind of life to sell yourself to servitude and dehumanization from Monday to Friday in order to buy the privilege of living on the weekends. But it's not so. This is not the worthiest life for a human being. There is no virtue in that, no expression of human excellence, no recognition of human dignity, but on the contrary, a degrading brutalization of human nature. So it's not education to prepare you and to convince you to live a life of quiet desperation toiling at what Marx called alienated labor. It's not education to prepare you for and convince you to sell your humanity for wages, whether it's low wages or high wages. Where I live in New York, I know many high-earning wage slaves. This isn't to say that education shouldn't enable students to make a better living than they would without an education, of course. It is to say that there is also a higher and more fundamental purpose to education. Education should also be about how to be free, about how to live the life of an autonomous moral agent, not just the life of a hired laborer. So that's one form of subjugation that exists today. There is another, a more pervasive kind of subjugation and slavery, and that is when one aspect of ourselves exerts tyrannical control over another. And here let me quote Jean-Jacques Rousseau from The Social Contract, where he sort of as a side comment says, "To be driven by appetite alone is slavery, and obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself is liberty." This even more pervasive aspect of servitude has to do with the contradictorily layered nature of our psyche. Freedom, it's great. We love it. But it brings its own problems. As you no doubt remember, one of the shocks of college life is the challenge of self-governance. Many people who fail at college fail not for intellectual reasons, that the material they're asked to learn is just too hard for them, but because of failures in self-governance. How do we organize the tangle of psychic forces, conflicting desires, and contradictory impulses that coexist in our mortal frame? We want to be fit, but we don't want to work out. We want to play an instrument and produce beautiful music for an audience, for our family, for our loved ones, but we don't want to practice. We want to lose weight, but we want to eat all of the desserts. And these desires are genuine, wholehearted, sincere. The mind, our capacity for desire, has no connection to our capacity for logical reasoning. And I submit to you that the maximal possibilities for human freedom come from the optimal organization, from the more or less successful integration of our inner lives. Enabling this is the most profound way in which liberal education is liberating. When Douglas, listening to his enslaver, recognizes that learning would forever unfit him to be a slave, he is hearing a recognition that education brings about inner developments that transform your life from the inside out in a way that liberates and that is irreversible. And liberal education is possible because we are rational beings who share in a condition that is unique among the forms of life that we know, and that is the condition of freedom. Now, there are, of course, lots of ways in which we're not free, ways also in which some of us are freer than others. We are enmeshed in contingency, subject to biological and evolutionary imperatives, driven by psychic forces and social forces, historical forces that are beyond our control and even beyond our awareness. So there are important ways in which we're not free. Yet, our condition as human beings brings with it an immediate and direct experience of freedom. I know that not everyone accepts this. Some scholars have argued that individual freedom is a liberal fantasy, an expression of bourgeois privilege, sometimes male white privilege. There certainly is such a thing as bourgeois privilege as well as male white privilege. And it's true that normative conceptions of freedom in Western political discourse have been shaped by these dominant vantage points. So I see where the critique is coming from. But there's more to the notion of freedom than is captured in that critique. The experience of freedom is a defining aspect of our humanity, quite apart from the social and historical conditions under which it has been theorized. Let me point to two ways in which this condition of freedom is evident in each of us. One is in the human capacity for self-reflection, the capacity by which we can become the subject of our own thought. Self-reflection is a very curious thing. When you reflect on yourself, you seek to discover something you did not know before. And that's because we're not transparent to ourselves. We are not self-present. By looking steadily at ourselves and asking questions of ourselves, we can learn things about ourselves that we did not know before. And then, this activity of self-reflection, this activity in which you become the subject of your own thought, transforms you. It activates a kind of metamorphosis. In the activity of seeing ourselves, we become something else. The object that we reflect on is changed by our reflection on it. And we can't know ahead of time how exactly that new self is going to be like before we become it. If we did, introspection would be impossible. So our capacity for self-reflection and the transformations inherent in that activity make us fundamentally incalculable beings, beings immersed in a kind of freedom constitutive of our human condition. Our experience of ourselves is the experience of freedom. A second way in which our experience of freedom is evident and inescapable, no matter how unfree we are, is that each of us must posit for ourselves some notion of the human good, some notion of what is the best kind of life that we can live, and then order our actions and pursuits according to that notion. No one can do that for you. You, and only you, have to work out what whole way of life is most worthwhile for you and then pursue it as best you can. It is an inescapable task inherent in our condition of freedom. And this aspect of our freedom, that each of us must find our way to some notion of the human good, is the starting point of liberal education. The fruit of liberal education is a form of knowledge that I call liberal knowledge. Liberal knowledge is different from the kind of knowledge that dominates in our society and especially in the university. As a shorthand, we call this dominant form of academic knowledge scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is progressive and exact. It builds on the discoveries of the past and adds on top of those in a cumulative way. You know, we understand infectious disease, electromagnetic radiation, climate change better today than we did 50 years ago. This is progress. But liberal knowledge doesn't quite progress in that way. We don't understand the experience of grief or how to live with the consequences of death or the meaning of love and nobility or the character of the most excellent life any better today than we did 100 years ago. The latest war novel is not an improvement on the Iliad. And the same goes for art. Warhol and Rothko are not superior to Michelangelo and Renoir. Art doesn't get better as time goes on. Now, I mentioned earlier how the term liberal education is not well understood. After I wrote my book, I decided to let my publishers, who know more than I do about selling books, to come up with a title. I did express my hope that the words liberal education would appear there. My hope was not fulfilled. What did make it to the title was the phrase, great books. How the great books changed my life and why they matter for a new generation. So let me say a few words about great books. I'll begin with the adjective great. With reference to books, great is, of course, a contestable term. We may disagree about what constitutes a great book. Not only that, some literary authorities believe that there is no such thing as a great book to begin with, that the designation great is only a way of asserting and perpetuating particular power structures and enforcing certain forms of discursive domination and exclusion. All I will say about that argument is that while it is based on an important insight, it takes that insight and turns it into an absurd dogma. And we can take the insight without adopting the dogma. We can think of a great book as one that contributes in some outstanding way to the kind of liberal education I have been describing. A great book speaks to our shared human condition. That is, it speaks beyond the immediate historical and cultural context from which it emerges. It is not great because it reflects its specific cultural, historic, and economic situatedness. It is great because it speaks beyond that to something that transcends historical particularity and illuminates our shared humanity. Moby Dick is not great because of its detailed portrait of the New England whaling industry. It is great for some other reason. The Divine Comedy is not great because of Dante's immersion in the theology of the medieval church or in the factional intrigues of central Italy's politics. The Divine Comedy is great because through the mist of those trappings, it can reveal something that is vitally meaningful to, say, a 21st century Dominican immigrant to the United States. By the same token, it's not Toni Morrison's rootedness in the legacy of American slavery that makes her novels great, but her ability to make that human experience alive and accessible to someone who has no historical connection to it. Great works are great because of a demonstrable and yet elusive capacity to illuminate our shared humanity. In the case of great literature, great books are not summarizable. You can only get what great literature has to give by experiencing it as it is. You have to go through it. It's the experience of it, not the knowledge of what it says, that does the work of literature. The Wikipedia entry will not do, the Spark Notes will not do, the summary will not do. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said of Revelation, it cannot be received secondhand. One more word about great literature, and with this, I'll begin to wrap up my remarks so we can do some Q&A. Great literature is the absolute best way we have of approaching the experience of what it's like to be someone else. In the form of the novel, I believe it is the most successful technology ever devised to understand the world from somebody else's point of view. You cannot get inside somebody else's head. The closest thing you can do is read great literature. Through great literature, you can spend hour after hour seeing the world and reasoning through situations with someone of a different gender, class, culture, and time. I was just talking outside about the novels of George Eliot. If you want to have that experience of being inside somebody else's head in a vivid, sometimes transformative way, sometimes ways that illuminates the way your own mind works, read George Eliot. You know, part of the problem with our technological revolution or revolutions is that they have been driven by engineering breakthroughs and shaped by people with computational genius who can be quite clueless and naive about history, philosophy, art, and literature. This is actually one of the reasons why liberal education, while being progressively weakened in the contemporary academy, is in fact more important today than it has ever been. To understand what is ethical, to understand what policies will work, to evaluate the consequences of a given technology, to anticipate how society will assimilate a scientific breakthrough or a historical turn, you need to understand something you can broadly call culture. You can think of culture as a grid of broadly interconnected practices, traditions, values, and implicit understandings in which every single individual is embedded. We live embedded in these webs and have no human existence outside of them. To understand people, to understand a people, you have to understand culture. And there is no better way to understand a culture than through the enduring stories it tells about itself and the arguments that have shaped its understanding of itself. Writing in 1940, the intellectual Louis Mumford, observing the rise of fascism in Europe, criticized Western liberalism for its tepid response and wrote an essay in the New Republic called The Corruption of Liberalism. One quote I like from that essay says, "It is not Ricardo or Marx, it's not in Ricardo or Marx or Lenin, but in Dante and Shakespeare and Dostoevsky that an understanding of the true sources of fascism are to be found." If you think today about the conflicts that are roiling our politics, our global order, the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in Palestine, the growing tensions between the West, especially the US and China, there is no way to reason and navigate those conflicts without a deep understanding, a deep exposure, a deep immersion in the cultures and histories that have shaped and continue to dominate the worldviews of the actors in those conflicts, including our own. Now, before I close, I want to return to the issue I raised earlier about what it would have taken for someone like me when I was in high school to understand what a liberal education is. It strikes me as a task of the greatest importance to expand the reach of liberal education to people who have traditionally been excluded from it. This matters to national life because we cannot have a prosperous society, a thriving society, a healthy society that is divided by privileges of birth and where individuals are structurally denied the tools for participation in collective self-governance. In my experience, when people are given a taste of what a liberal education is and what it does, they want it for themselves and for their children. People have an impulse toward freedom and self-determination, a hunger for truth and self-transcendence that makes liberal education immediately compelling. Sometimes people say that the point of liberal education is exactly its uselessness, that it is not pursued as a means to obtain something else, but that it is simply sought for its own sake. I see the point, but I don't think that that's the best way of framing it. A liberal education is extremely useful, and we pursue it for the highest of human ends. To put it simply, a liberal arts education is there to help you find your way. And this is your basic task in life, to find your way. There is, in the final analysis, nothing else to do in your life but to find your way. Not someone else's way, not the way of your role models, not the way of success, but your way. A liberal education does not tell you what your way is, but it equips you for a kind of self-exploration and investigation of the world around you that can lead to genuine living, to a life of honesty and clarity. That life might include making a lot of money, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make people rich. That life might include having an impact on many lives around you, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you a benefactor of humanity. That life might include many friends, or it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make one popular or affable. But a liberally educated life will be richer than otherwise. It will be more true. It will be more awake. It will be more alive and creative, and it will be more free. To modify a quote from Henry David Thoreau, if a liberal education does one thing, it is to ensure that when you come to die, you don't then discover that you have not lived. Thank you.
Dr. Montás. Thank you, Dr. Montás. We have probably about 15 minutes or so for questions.
Mic is not on yet.
My mic was turned off.
There it
Sorry.
is.
Interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm not sure, I'm interested to read your book. I'm not sure if what you have articulated is an encouragement about where the humanities and liberal education go, or is an indictment of where it now is. Early in the talk, you talked about enslavement, and you talked about two elements of it, one of which was working for wages, the other of which was, I think, living under the domination of, let's say, the culture or views outside yourself. You're speaking, I think, largely to a Christian audience, and I also see my children who are raised in the church. When they go off to college, they come back with different ideas. As a, for instance, that their work is meant to be some sort of self-actualization, where biblically it's meant to be basically the sweat of your brow to put the food on the table and to live a life. So I'm not sure that view of self-actualization is really the right view. As far as the dominant culture, there's two wonderful books that have transformed my thinking. One is The Rise, and I think it may have been a speaker here, Carl Trueman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. The other is by Robert Bork, Slouching to Gomorrah. And in both those books, they talk about radical individualism that has sort of destroyed what was America. And lots of talk of freedom, which you talked about time and again in this talk. But freedom will never work if it's not balanced by responsibility. And a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the university and in our culture is runaway freedom with a complete loss of any sense of responsibility to others around you, as everyone seeks the grand imaginary and wonderful self-actualization. So I'm a little bit puzzled as to where sort of you stand on those things.
Great, thank you. There's a lot there. Let me make a few comments. First, you started by wondering whether my talk is an indictment of what we're doing with liberal education or an encouragement. In some ways, it's both. The book I wrote traces there are three strands that make it up. One is part of my own experience with liberal education, which the outlines of which I shared here. One is a reading of four writers that exemplify the power of a liberal education. One is St. Augustine and his autobiographical work, The Confessions. And I reflect on what it was like to read that book as a first-year student in college and what it's been like to teach that book and to live with that book. Another one is on Plato and Socrates, a third one on Sigmund Freud, and a fourth one on Mahatma Gandhi. But then the third strand of the book is a critique of higher education. Because higher education is not, by and large, doing liberal education, even with people who major in the liberal arts. And in the book I talk, and I could speak at length about why today's education fails to be liberal and why even sorts of education that call themselves liberal education are in fact not doing that. I also talk about how I think it should be done, how I think it can be done. There are many ways of doing it, but I present what I take to be the most effective way of doing it. Some of the other questions you raise, part of the experience of sending a child to college and the child coming back with strange ideas or ideas that we find to be either misguided, misinformed, or some kind of indoctrination. Part of that is just that people grow up and they sometimes change their minds from the values or the ideas that they grew up with. Part of it is also that universities are not doing liberal education, that too many universities are in fact using education to indoctrinate students into particular ideological dispositions. But that happens both to the right and to the left. It happens mainly to the left because of the character of higher education. But a word about freedom. There's that quote there from Rousseau that says that to be driven by appetite alone in slavery and to obey the laws which one has formulated for ourselves is freedom. Freedom is not doing whatever you want. Freedom is organizing your life around an order whose truth and reality you have accepted and you have decided to conform your life to it. There is a way in which one can have chaos, one can have anarchy, but one can't be not subject to some rule and be free. You said that this is largely a Christian audience, so you will surely recognize Jesus' words, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." One thing I love about that quote is that Jesus doesn't say the truth will make you free, but he says you will know the truth, and that knowledge will make you free. And it then doesn't say that knowledge will free you, but the knowledge will make you free. That is, there is an inner transformation that the truth brings about that makes you free. That is the kind of freedom that a liberal education fosters. It is not go it alone, seek your self-interest, individualism. So liberal education, which comes, as I said, in the context of how do we live in a self-governing society. Liberal education is about how to achieve collective self-governance. And that requires negotiation, that requires dialogue, that requires conforming to an expression of collective will. So it is far from individualism in the crass sense, in the sense that that America is often connected with or thought about individualism. In my view, liberal education is not compatible with any specific ideology. That is, liberal education equips you to attain and to reach a conviction about the values that are going to guide your life. And that could be secular, it could be religious. I mean, one of the books I write about is St. Augustine, who, through his liberal education and through his inquiry and commitment to a life of examination and search for the truth, arrives at Christianity. So it doesn't lead you away from religion just because it's a liberal education. But it also doesn't lead you toward religion. Liberal education enables you and gives you the capacity to ask the big questions and to work out answers that are genuine to you. And I'm not saying that to say that it's all relative, because it's not. I think there are points of convergences where people end. But that's not the liberal education doesn't dwell in the answers, it dwells in the questions.
Thank you so much for that. That was great. I'm wondering if you could speak to the way that you, as a teacher, have worked to cultivate that different paradigm of attention and interest in the propositions and the goals of the liberal education, because you described it well as saying that it's like a fog, and if you are accustomed to being given information via the hard sciences, or if you are accustomed to being treated like an audience member by social media, then the notion that you have to work for yourself and go into the fog towards things unknown requires a different kind of fitness. And I don't want to say that social media is like the new version of this problem. Wordsworth decries, the hourly reporting of extraordinary incident, and this was like 200 years ago. If he could have seen social media, he would have just gone mad. But all of my students are on their phones during class, and I can't rebuke them in any meaningful way. And so I'm sure you've experienced this. How do you get them to care?
I don't let them use their phones in my class, is one thing. Or computers, unless they have a disability that requires accommodation, of course. But I think the conception of liberal education that I'm describing does have implications about the modality in which it can be delivered. And one of them is that liberal education has to be done on the basis of conversation. Liberal education is a thing that happens between people. And the student, we have a text that we read, or a picture that we look at, or a film that we watch. There is some provocative content that raises questions, that is sort of meaty, that is fundamental in some way. But then the education happens around dialogue between students and the professor. The professor has a kind of shepherding function of guiding, provoking, keeping things within certain bounds. Sometimes, especially in recent years, I have found that a big part of my job as a professor is to be the protector of minority opinion. That is, being someone who creates the room for minority opinions to be articulated and to be debated. So there is a very important container that the instructor provides. But the education happens in the dialogue, in the debate, in the conversation, in the exploration. So it cannot be delivered through a lecture. It cannot be, you can't just watch a YouTube and get, or a recorded lecture and get liberal education. There are things that you can get that way for sure, and that are important, and that matter a lot in education. But this thing of the cultivation of a certain capacity for dialogue, for exploration, for introspection, for seeing the other side of arguments, for encountering and metabolizing different opinions. The liberal arts classroom is maybe the central place where we can realize the promise, the educational promise of diversity. Diversity in education has been recognized by the Supreme Court. It's even legally encoded that diversity in education is hugely beneficial. That is, to experience education with people who are really different than you is really, really important and enriches your education. But the only way that's going to happen is if those differences shape the conversation. That is, we can have diverse campuses, and often do, in which people come and they just immediately self-segregate. They join the same groups, they attend the same extracurricular activities, they sit in the same places in the cafeteria, they take the same classes, they have the same professors. Might as well not be diverse. The place in which we realize the promise of diversity is in the classroom, where people are talking to each other who have sometimes fundamentally different worldviews and backgrounds and opinions and values, and can do so in a respectful, inquisitive, curious way. That is indispensable in a liberal education. So you need a format in which that happens. You need a skillful instructor that can facilitate that. You need a text that provokes those questions. it's very hard work. It's much harder to be a liberal arts instructor, professor, than it is to teach in your own discipline. I mean, when I give a lecture on Frederick Douglass or Emerson or Lincoln or the Constitution, I just stand there in front of a group of people and I show my slides and I give my lecture and I go home. And that's stuff that I know that I can do, not quite in my sleep, but I can do it quite sleepily. When I enter my liberal arts classroom and I'm reading St. Augustine or I'm reading Nietzsche or I'm reading Marx or I'm reading Aquinas or I'm reading the Quran, with students who are reading it for the first time and engaging in a dialogue with them, I have to be there on in an entirely different way. So this conception of liberal education has implications about its mode of delivery. It can't just be done in any way. And you can't do it for students by telling them the way you're going to get a liberal education is by taking 3 courses in history and 2 in English and 1 in a foreign language and 1 in science. Go and do that and you've got a liberal education. Not at all. But that is what most universities are doing. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Would you, as a beneficiary of the 3rd of 4 generations who've been blessed with the opportunity of a liberal education, would you speak to the economic realities? Because my friends talk about the indebtedness of undergraduate education, which in essence seems to produce that into trade school nature, whereas we saw education for earning one's keep as graduate school beyond that, or a trade school or something that would be supplemental to liberal education. And the increased indebtedness is there, and especially now with distance learning, which is one of the answers for that, distancing one from the person who would encourage this kind of conversation.
Right, great. That's a great question. The cost of higher education is out of control and scandalous. It's and the reasons, I'm not an economist, but I live in higher education. There are a number of factors that drive it. Some of it has to do with public divestment in public institutions, just massive withdrawal of public support. Some of it has to do with a tremendous bureaucracy in the universities, and part of which is driven by an expectation that a student is not just there to take classes, but to have health insurance and gyms and psychological counseling and health care and excellent food and parties and dormitories and et cetera. So that, and then there's fierce competition for that, so that if you don't have a good gym, then you won't get any students. So there are a lot of reasons why education has become, I think, unacceptably costly. And then there's this confusion where the financial aid that you get is often dependent on your need, so that the sticker price of a school is sort of meaningless. I went to Columbia, which is, it used to be the most expensive undergraduate school. If it's not there, it's up there. And I paid almost nothing because I came from absolute poverty. But so many of my students, I teach high school students who are low income. Many of them look at the sticker price and say, I'm not going to apply to that college because look how expensive it is. But it turns out that some of those most expensive colleges are actually cheaper for them than some of the supposedly cheaper schools. So there's this tremendous confusion. But to get to your point, part of what I am advocating and part of the work that I do in higher education is to orient curricula towards providing a liberal education for every student, regardless of their major. That is, we have for too long seen liberal education as one of several things you can do in college. You can be an engineer, you can be pre-med, you can be a computer scientist, you can be a lawyer, or you can study liberal arts. And that is completely misguided. What we need to do is offer liberal education as the foundation for every specialization. We cannot ask students in this economy, in this world today, with the cost of college, to go and get a degree and major in an area where there are no jobs. Especially we can't do that to low-income students who are looking at college as a way to get out of poverty. I am a huge advocate of liberal education. I am not an advocate of the liberal arts major. I love liberal arts. I major in the liberal arts. I teach liberal arts majors. But I'm not out there to convince people to major in the liberal arts. I am out there to convince people, and especially institutions, to make liberal education the foundation for every degree. The engineer needs it, the banker needs it, the chemist needs it, the lawyer needs it, the humanist needs it. So we need to bake in a strong core curriculum embedded in every undergraduate degree so that it is not an opportunity cost to become liberally educated. To me, that's where the game is. I would like to see many liberal arts majors, but there isn't a, it is to fundamentally mistake the job of the university, to make liberal education one track you can follow among other tracks.
Dr. Montás, thank you so much for your talk. Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude our evening. The Amundsons would like to remind you that the next event coming up is on Friday, December 8th, the Christmas concert, and that's going to feature Tyler Wigglesworth and his choir, the West Coveres. We hope to see you all there on December 8th. Thank you so much for coming.